We are.
All right. Well, welcome. And thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Pam Clark-Reidenbach, and I am the Executive Director of NICNE, the Northern Illinois Center for Nonprofit Excellence. I also want to take this time to introduce Billy Callahan, who's the Associate Director of NICNE and is the technological genius of our center. So thank you, Billy, for all your support. It is our pleasure to have you with us today at the second session of NICNE's Volunteerism Conference, which is based on the topic and focused on the topic of belonging, a topic that is extremely relevant today and every day, frankly. The format for the session today is a presentation, and we'll introduce our speaker shortly. We're going to ask you to put your computers on mute, if you would, please, throughout the presentation. But the presentation is followed then by a dialogue, a conversation that is facilitated by our friends Keri Asevedo and Martesha Brown, who are both with us on the Zoom this morning. So thank you again for joining us. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter this morning. Shiraz Tata is a PhD. She's a licensed clinical psychologist, meditation teacher, and social justice facilitator in Rockford. She recently retired from NIU and has extensive experience and expertise in diversity and inclusion. We could not be more pleased to have Shiraz with us today. So please help me to welcome Shiraz Tata.
Thank you, Pam. It's my pleasure to be here with you this morning. And as Pam said, when you met with Jocelyn for the keynote, I think most of you were there last month, we will take a slightly deeper dive into looking at understanding bias and see how that relates to the ways in which we might foster belonging and hopefully reduce feelings of othering in our volunteer group as well as in our organizations. So want to welcome you to this space and so glad that you're here. I know there's a lot going on in our world right now, and so to start with, just want to ask you to take a deep breath with me. Just drop your shoulders a little and maybe let go of some of the things we're carrying as we come into this space this morning. Just taking a deep breath in and out and feeling some of that tension just going down our backs into the seat that we're on and coming into this space. And really want us to take set a frame of self-compassion as we start to think about bias. And the reason I say that is that, you know, we all have biases, implicit and explicit. And it's important for us to accept that that is the way it is, rather than beating ourselves up for it, because when we get too critical, sometimes we get paralyzed. We do want to nudge ourselves and have a compassionate curiosity towards what they are. But I'd like us to set a frame of compassion as we start today. I also want to say, I know Pam said this will be a presentation, and I will be presenting information, sharing my screen. At the same time, I will be posing some compassionately curious questions for you to ponder, and would welcome your sharing back some of your thoughts and feelings and insights as we go through this hour together. I know there's going to be more chance for discussion later, but I do have some questions woven in, because I don't want you to have to listen to me the whole hour without any interaction. And we wish we could have broken into small groups and, you know, been seeing each other today. But given this format, I know Billy's going to help me, you know, be watching for those of you who might raise your hand and put it to speaker view and help us talk with each other some, even though this is a different way of doing things that we're all getting used to. So thanks for bearing with us as we do this in the best way possible given this format. But wonderful to see all your faces. I do appreciate some of you having your videos on so we can see each other, because Le Monroy, who is one of my gurus in terms of facilitating conversations, says, let's start with just looking at each other's faces, because often we rush into things and don't even notice who we are with. And I think being present with each other, especially when we have difficult conversations or are reflecting on things that are not easy to reflect on, it's nice to look at each other's faces and know who's with us and be present with each other. So I appreciate your being present with me and each other. And as I said, as we start, let's set a frame of self-compassion. And what I mean by that is to kind of place guilt and shame aside so that we can actually have a compassionate curiosity and work on a solution together. Also, I think that when we can name things, it becomes a little easier to work with things. You know, being a psychologist, I often talk about how I have a shadow. We all have a bit of a shadow side, or we all have things we may not be aware of. And if we can name them, it gets a little easier to work with them. So some guidelines, and I'm sure you've all done this kind of thing before and so are aware of these. But as far as possible, when we are in this space, and especially when I'm asking you some questions, also just to do this in a trauma-informed way, I want to invite you to pay attention to where you are and how deep you want to go, how much you want to share. You have some choices. Even when I pose questions, I might give you a couple choices on what you want to reflect on. You know, we want to respect that there will be different perspectives. We will all have something important to contribute, even if we might have different ideas about things. And also to make space and take space as we do this together. Also, just that given some of the questions I'm asking might tap into something personal for you, if we can keep what is shared here, especially if there's some personal stories shared here, and take our learning, of course, with us into our spaces and be able to apply it where we go. And let's clarify our understanding with further questions. Does that sound okay to people? In terms of where we're going this morning and how we're getting started with this frame? Okay, great. It's nice to see heads nodding. I love the interaction. So just to start with, and just want to highlight that Jocelyn did a great job, and Jocelyn's someone I worked with NIU for a number of years, facilitating diversity dialogues, of talking about explicit and implicit bias. And I know that Billy has shared that link with everyone for those of you who may not have been here. So I'm just going to speak briefly about explicit and implicit bias before we start applying this to our own lives and getting clearer about it for ourselves. So as you might remember Jocelyn saying, and I will share my screen here so you can see the slide. Let's see here. So with explicit bias, it's more explicit, as the name suggests, right? We're more clear about our feelings and attitudes and related behaviors that might actually be carried out with intent. Explicit bias is processed neurologically at a more conscious level. It's declarative, semantic memory is involved, and we can express it more clearly in words. It may arise more due to a perceived threat, leading people to draw group boundaries to separate themselves from others. And we are seeing that more in this time. But explicit biases can be helpful sometimes or hurtful at sometimes as well. For example, I might have an explicit bias about having a certain kind of volunteer join the organization. You may even maybe put that out there in a job description, that you're looking for a person with certain kinds of skills, or you're looking for a person with certain amount of experience. Or we might just be more aware that, you know, this is something that I'm kind of biased towards, that for example, I might, you know, my husband will be the first to say that I'm probably more biased to talking more with people who might be more willing to share some more of themselves than with those who may not. So that's a pretty explicit bias, and it's good for me to be aware of that, and be aware that I need to also make space for other kind of people when I'm having a dialogue. Implicit bias, on the other hand, is something that may be more unconscious. Attitudes, stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions and decisions in a more unconscious manner. Shaped by our social conditioning at an early age and kind of beneath our level of awareness. So not conscious. And so we might want to also be kind to ourselves, and even when we see it in others, be kind, thinking, given it is somewhat unconscious, it may not necessarily be malicious. It's what pops up for us often, even unconsciously. For example, and for those of us, Phelan talks about how for those of us who might actually see ourselves as being more progressive or more open-minded, it might be even harder for us to actually acknowledge when some of our unconscious biases pop. Like, you know, when I might hold my purse closer to me when someone comes into an elevator, I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing? And what does this mean? But for me to acknowledge that perhaps some fear gets triggered for me, even though I've done years of this work, is important to look at where is that coming from? Why is it still here? And be aware of that.
So would you click slideshow view? Sorry. Would you click slideshow view for the presentation? It'll make this font a little bit larger for everyone.
Okay, let me see where I can do that.
It's right on the bottom right, that little symbol. Perfect, yep.
There we go. Is that better? Okay, great, great. So what I want us to remember about implicit bias, and you might say, well, what am I to do here? You know, these things do pop sometimes, and it doesn't feel good to me. I don't know what to do with it. And what I would suggest, and I'm trying to do this for myself too, is after our first response to someone or something, which is probably influenced by our implicit biases, it might be a kind of a gut reaction, as we say. I think it's really important to pause and to breathe, and then to make a judgment or decision. Some of you in this country, lots of people like peanut butter and jelly, or those peanut butter bars that are a peanut butter dessert. So you could remember PBJ or PBD. But I think it's really important to pause and breathe. And the reason I say that is that some of the research that's been done by Phelan and Banerjee and others on implicit bias shows that different parts of our brain are actually lighting up when we are having certain kinds of thoughts about, especially about people who we don't see as part of our in-group, or certain kinds of thoughts that may be related to a threat that we might feel, because we're not as familiar with this group of people, or this kind of experience that we might be having, or something that we're being challenged to do at a particular time. So it has to do with some of our physiology really in our brain. The part of the brain that gets activated, as you all probably know, with knowing some about the fight, flight, freeze response, that part of the brain that gets activated is a part of the brain that was not made for higher order thinking or problem solving. But the research also shows that when we breathe, take a few deep breaths even, give a little more oxygen to our brains, the part of the brain that starts to get activated is the part of the brain that is actually made for higher order thinking or problem solving. And so taking a breath after pausing and sort of looking at what's going on here for me, and then making a judgment or decision that helps us act in a way that fits more with our values, or in a way that fosters belonging and not othering, I think can be really useful and important. Is that making sense? Because I think if we get real critical or too anxious when we notice, oops, I've said something that I shouldn't have said, or I'm thinking something that I don't know where this is coming from, then we freeze. And if we can even notice when we're freezing and instead pause, breathe, and then make a decision, I think that that can be a helpful way to deal with some of the implicit bias that will pop from time to time. Just like in meditation, I say, we will get distracted. It's par for the course. I think that that can be an important strategy as we come across our implicit biases, as we notice when they pop. So I'm going to ask you to do something here real quick. I'm hoping you have some paper or pen close to you. If you don't, you can take a minute to grab one. And I'm going to say, let's draw. And I want you to just pay attention even to what's the thought that came up right away when I said, let's draw. I know sometimes when I'm asked to draw, my thought is, oh my gosh, I can't draw. You know, you're going to have me draw? Are you kidding me? I wasn't prepared for that this morning. Or, you know, I feel a little stress about it in my body because I'm being asked to do something that I'm not usually being asked to do. And I want you to just reflect a little bit for yourself on if you did feel a little stress when I said, let's draw, if being an artist is not something that fits with your identity or how you see yourself, where did you feel that stress in your body? Or what did you say to yourself?
Are you talking to me?
That may be a clue that you are getting stressed. And you might say, why am I asking you to do that? I'm asking you to do that because our biases get more pronounced when we are under stress, or when we are feeling a little threatened or challenged in some way. And I know for me, it's really helpful, and that's why I'm asking you to do this, trying to ask you to do some things that I would be willing to do myself, is to pay attention to how do you know when you are getting stressed? What do you say to yourself when you might start feeling a higher level of stress? Does your self-talk shift? Do you feel it somewhere in your body? I know for me, my voice starts getting a little higher when I get anxious, and that's a clue for me, or my neck will start to hurt. Or in the longer frame picture, if I start losing things, that means my level of stress is going higher. And so it's helpful, I think, to pay attention to that. But in terms of what you're wondering, what is she going to ask us to draw? Something really simple, actually. I'm going to have you draw your lens. Just draw a lens, whatever lens comes up for you. It could be a camera lens, a telescope lens, a microscope lens, I don't know, your glasses. It'd be interesting to see even what comes to mind for you when you hear the word lens. I'll just let you take a minute to do that. And the reason I'm having you do that is because our biases are influenced by our lens. And that's where we're trying to take a slightly deeper dive today. I'm just getting my phone out so I know what time it is here. But if you could put down in that lens, once you draw it out, what are a couple of things that really influence your lens? And this exercise could take an hour if you want to write on more later or reflect more about this. But for now, with our limited time this morning, just want you to pay attention as you draw this lens out, just to jot down, what are a couple of things that you know really influence your lens or the way you view the world? And again, there's no right or wrong here. For each of us, it's different things. could be connected to the way we identify, could be connected to the family and societal culture we grew up in, could be connected to our beliefs, our values. Take a moment to write down what influences your cultural lens. Or own personal lens. And when you are ready to, I'll give you another minute to do that. For example, for me, I know growing up in India, there are some values and beliefs that influence my lens. Being a psychologist influences my lens. Wanting harmony, that's something that's an important value for me, influences my lens. But I want you to pay attention to what influences your lens. I don't know if a couple of you would be willing to share some things that came up as you jotted some things down. You can unmute and share out.
I would just say my past experiences, positive and negative.
Absolutely. Sure. And being aware of what those are is important. That those tend to pop and might be influencing our biases as well, or how we might respond to things. Anyone else? Yes, Harlan.
Curiosity, novelty, beauty.
Curiosity, novelty, and beauty. So those are some values for you, and those influence your lens. Absolutely, absolutely. Anyone else? One last person, maybe?
For me, it might be location, situation, those who are around me, my family, my work.
Sure, sure, absolutely, absolutely. You know, and I'd encourage you later to maybe write a little more about how you see those as influencing you. Because as I say, the more we can name things, the more we can understand the way we are influenced, the more we might even be able to tap into some of our unconscious biases or even our implicit biases. All right. And now, given you are all working in wonderful organizations, I know a number of you are involved with a number of volunteer organizations or organizations that recruit volunteers, I think it's helpful to also reflect on what is our organization's lens. You know, and when I looked up some information about lenses of organizations, some of the things that people talked about was that there might be three different kinds of lenses or things that are important in organizations. The strategic part, which is the processes and procedures. You might have a policy and procedures manual looking at our job descriptions of volunteers clear, are our expectations clear about certain values or ethics that we expect people to follow when they are part of this organization. The second is the political, and what they meant by political more is being aware of the interrelationships between people, and particularly the way in which authority and power plays a role in the organization. How hierarchical might your organization be, but also to look at who holds power. And I liked the way they put this, is who holds power, and is that power held due to the position that the person is in? Some people will hold power because they are the executive director or the volunteer coordinator or a particular role, or who holds power because they have more subtle influence? So you may even have a person in your organization that someone looking in may not think holds a lot of power, but does because of their personality or the way in which they promote interpersonal relationships between people. I often think of folks who are often at our front desks. Right now, I know we're a lot of us working remotely, but You know, people who welcome people, who greet people, they hold power. People who might just be leaders, informal leaders within your organization or your volunteer group. And the third is the culture. What are our values? What are our success and challenge stories? What is the history of our organization? And also, how does one motivate change? So if you'd like, take a moment to just think about in what are some things that influences my organization's lens, and as a result might influence some biases that we as an organization might have. And I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just reflect on that and maybe jot just a couple things down. Because knowing our organization's culture is important. Or even knowing what the organization might look like to somebody coming in. Because I think sometimes we, when we're part of an organization, are real aware. This is who we are, this is how we do things. But we may not be aware of how we look when somebody comes in. So take a moment to jot down what might be influencing my organization's lens, particularly when it comes to our volunteer base. And what might people see when they come in? And as I say that, and as you jot that down, I'm just struck by how I know an organization I worked with felt like, well, we are very welcoming of everybody. You know, we are a safe place, I guess is what we would say. And some new people coming in said, I know you all keep saying that, but I don't know that about you yet. I'm new. You know, I'm going to need to get to know you to feel that level of safety. And kind of our bias was, well, we're a safe place. Why don't you engage more with us? And it took someone saying, you know, wait a minute, you need to give me a little time to do this kind of engagement. Is that making sense? You know, kind of having an openness to hearing some feedback also, particularly our volunteers who may be new to us, who might come in with their own experiences and be able to give us some feedback. Anyone want to share a little about what your reflection is in terms of your own organization's lens or culture and how it might influence some biases that your organization might have as you recruit volunteers or try and retain them or train them in some ways? Would anyone like to share out about that?
Probably easier to talk about ourselves than it is to talk about our organization. So for us, I work with Habitat for Humanity. So I would say one of the things that probably influences our lens the most is our Christian values. Okay. Which is what both our board of directors and our volunteer base is kind of you know, rooted in. And so with that comes a significant amount of bias.
Sure, sure, sure. And looking at what are some positive ways and that might influence your culture and be welcoming of people, and what are some ways that might create a barrier. So I think it's important to look at the and. That's the other thing I often remind myself of, is it's often issues are not either or, there's often an and in there. And I think it's important again to compassionately look at those ands. Anyone else have a, and I also remember, Keri, I watched the video from when Jocelyn was here and you talked about how we have most people with one syllable names. And you know, how might that come across to someone coming in, and might you need to take a little extra effort to welcome someone with a two-syllable name?
Yes, our volunteers consistently call our homeowners by the wrong name, and sometimes just blatantly come up with one-syllable nicknames for them. Yeah, it's an interesting, we laugh about it at our staff meetings, but it's a real phenomenon.
Yeah. So how is that impacting people? Some people, they're able to chuckle with it with you, that's fine. But some people, if they're offended, well, how do we deal with that? Sure. one more person if you'd like to share a little, otherwise I will keep going.
So for us, ours, by like the way that our board is where, you know, the top of our thing. So how that trickles down. But, you know, we don't have, I've never met our board members as the volunteer coordinator. So I'm speaking for people on the outreach side of my position that I've never met and that I don't know in the community. And so sometimes I find it very hard to talk about, you know, how we would handle something because I don't know. So I always go back to our mission, and that's how, you know, that's the lens that I go through, because I can't really speak for everybody in the building type of thing, even though I have no idea. I have no idea who sits on our board and things like that. I'm very new, and with only being here a year, so.
Sure. You're bringing up a couple of very important points. One is communication, and you know, our perception influences how we communicate things, and how we might communicate with our volunteers as well. And you're in a difficult position, but you're also I think you're grounding yourself in the mission, which is often the values we hold in an organization. And I think that can be an important place to ground in terms of what are our values, because that is what grounds and leads the organization. But I'm also wondering if you might be able to ask to talk to or meet the board. Is that a possibility?
I've been here for a year and I've asked 3 times. So
wow. Yeah, I thought you might have. Yes. So that can be frustrating. Yeah.
Especially when I'm speaking, because my role is the volunteer programs manager and outreach coordinator. So my role is actually to go out and talk about what we do here and how we, you know, serve. And for me, sometimes it's very hard because somebody be like, oh, I know so-and-so on your board. And I'm like, oh, I'm glad you do.
Yes.
You know, kind of thing. And these are the people that I speak for, you know, and that's kind of hard for me. So it's trying the hardest to keep just my mission in mind.
Absolutely. So as people are listening, I'm sure we're all thinking of various ways this could be problematic, because this can kind of trickle down to how you're feeling. And when we're feeling a little helpless and frustrated, how does that influence, you know, how we're doing things? I mean, you're grounding beautifully, but that can make your role hard, and carrying that function out difficult. Absolutely. All right. So this is, you know, and knowing our organization's culture is important. And does everyone have a sense of the culture and feel welcomed and know how to share ideas and concerns and work towards growth and positive change? I think that can be really, really important, and some of what you've shared is highlighting how difficult it can be when that doesn't happen. I want us to, as I'm going to shift, I'm realizing we're halfway through here, and want us to start applying these lenses to ways in which this impacts the sense of belonging we might feel, and also how to increase a sense of belonging for our volunteers in our organizations. And I often, and again, this is my bias as a psychologist, I'll own that, but I often think that if I can reflect on my own experience in terms of being an outsider or an insider, and get in touch with how that felt for me, I can empathize better with other people who might be having an outsider or an insider experience. Is that making sense? Or other people who might be feeling like they belong or don't feel like they belong. And so I'm going to give you a choice here. I want to do this in a trauma-informed way, and some of you may be willing to reflect on your outsider experience. Some of you may be more willing to reflect on an insider experience. So we're kind of halfway through. I want to just have you adjust your posture a little bit wherever you are. Kind of take a breath if you need to, and even close your eyes if you want, and just visualize and think of a time and I'm starting with the outsider experience, but think of a time where you felt like an outsider, and pick something that was not too traumatic, because we're not going to have a lot of time to process here today. But sometime when you felt like an outsider, maybe even within the organization you're in right now, especially how it might have impacted how engaged or not then you remained with your group after that experience, and how that experience shaped the lens of who you are and how you behave in similar settings. Is that making sense? Okay, so take a moment to do that, and I'm going to give people a choice. Some of you may prefer not to go there, maybe just too painful to even go to that place right now. And so, or for whatever reason, if you prefer to reflect on an insider experience, reflect on an experience where you really felt like you were an insider, where your presence and skills really mattered. And what was the impact of that in terms of how you continue to engage with this group or this organization? How did this experience shape your lens and how you behaved in similar situations or settings? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just reflect on one or the other. And maybe easier to reflect on the insider today, given our limited time. If you're going to the outsider, I'd pick something that wasn't too hurtful for you. Given we're not here in person, and we could do a deeper dive with that some other time. But just wanting you to be aware of how feeling like an insider or an outsider affects your continued engagement with where you are or what you're working on or who you're with, and how it might shape your lens and how you behave in similar situations or settings. And this could take out an hour or two if we go deep, but just want you to, that's why I'd maybe pick something not too poignant here, but be able to reflect on that for yourself, because I think when we're able to put ourselves in someone's shoes or reflect on our own feelings about an experience, we're much more likely to be able to empathize than if we're talking about something that's outside our experience. Although we do have to do that too in this world for sure, to be able to understand people who have different experiences than our own. Any thoughts or feelings? Anyone want to share what came up for you and how that might influence your continued engagement?
I'll share, because
Sure.
I'm not afraid to talk ever. Sorry, guys.
Who are we hearing from? I'm not seeing you, but.
Kristen Krieger.
Okay.
Yeah. So I work with the Scouts.
Okay.
And I have been on like service unit boards or things like that where we're the leaders for those who lead our girls. And really, as being part of that group that organizes and like being the insider, I felt like a lot of times, because we just knew what was going on, we would exclude people or fail to ask if anybody else wanted to be involved.
Okay, sure.
And that was something that, you know, as a new leader myself, when I started, I was like, oh, you know, I didn't really feel super welcome, but I kind of pushed my way in because, as people can tell, I'm not shy. So I was like, yep, I'm going to do this. And I became part of that. And then I realized that I started becoming part of that problem, that I would be like, well, I can just do it. I've done it for years. I'll just do it, instead of engaging and asking people to come and join us. We would ask them to be leaders, but beyond that, like in the leadership roles in scouting, and I was both Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, so it was both organizations. We did that a lot. We just said, oh, well, nobody volunteered. And then I realized, no, we didn't ask.
Yeah.
So
that's great that you realized that, Kristen. You know, that's that pausing rather than just keeping on going. Well, nobody asked, I'm frustrated. Well, we are going to have to keep doing this. You know, you paused and realized, well, maybe there's a reason nobody's volunteering.
Right, and we didn't ask, you know, we would ask the leaders, but how were the leaders passing that message on to, say, their parents? And
Right.
were they getting engaged? Or were they, you know, everybody's like, oh, they just use me as a babysitting service sometimes. And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure if you asked them to stay specifically, they would stay. So, or like we have all these people who are in all these different career paths and have all this knowledge, and we're searching for people to do our Veterans Day thing, and we have 4 parents that are sitting right there,
Right,
that are veterans, you know. So it was kind of like one of those things, like we just never, it took a while for us to stop and think, like, use the
absolutely.
resources we already have.
Yes, yes. So being present, you know, and that's where I'm trying to really include mindfulness in our social justice work, or just include that concept of being present. That's so important, that pausing and noticing and being willing to look at when something's not working. Is that part of, because our bias is coming through in a way that is influencing the way we're functioning. And I think that that can be really, really helpful. Okay, well, thank you, Kristen, for sharing that experience. I think it highlights an important thing there. I wish we had more time, maybe for one more, but I do know I want to share some of John Powell's work with you, and so I'm feeling a little pressed for time. Is anyone else feeling really pressed to share something that might be poignant? And I'm aware the way I'm asking is not very welcoming, is it?
I have a story I'd like to share.
Yes.
So I am obviously a white woman, and I traveled to China, to Beijing, with my mom.
Okay.
And it was the first experience that I had ever had being so different from everyone that I ever encountered.
Sure.
I was very tall, I looked very different, did not speak the language. And it was the first time that I was in such a stark contrast to where I grew up in suburban America.
Sure.
And while I've always felt very empathetic and liberal and, like, social justice, it really helped me internalize the struggle that I think so many people face here.
Yes.
And it's shaped, a lot of the encounters I have, or also in kind of relaying it to my family or other people I meet, and how to help them understand the difficulties that folks face. It was such an eye-opening, and I'm so grateful for that experience, because I'm sure people like that feel that way in America all the time, and it was very interesting.
Sure, sure. And who am I? Who was I hearing from there?
Sorry, I'm Megan Conway with Hanover Township Aging Services.
Thank you, Megan, for sharing that. You're absolutely right. I had that experience when I went to, I'm from India, and so know about the immigrant experience and the international student experience, but I don't know if you spoke a language that was spoken in China, but when I was in Japan, that was the first time I could not understand or speak anything. And it was frightening, because no one around me was speaking a language I could speak.
Exactly, and just like the nuances of the culture were so different with how people approached, like, engaging with each other and just general discourse. It was exactly like every single minute of the day was so different, and it really helped me understand what that must be like for people living in another country permanently.
Sure, sure, and how it feels to feel different in many, many different ways, because that feeling does go into how we function, or how we're able to even function in different settings. So thank you both of you for sharing your experiences. I think that really helped us here, and I'd encourage each of you to continue to reflect on this. And now I'm going to ask you to hold on to these as we listen to John Powell talk about ways of fostering belonging and othering. And John Powell has done a lot of research on this, and I'm going to introduce his concept a little bit, and then we're going to listen to him. But he talks about how there are two emerging stories as he thinks about othering and belonging. That there is one story of a smaller and smaller we that fears, dominates, and controls others. And then there's a story of an expanding we that shares the earth and each other with dignity and respect and care. And othering is a general set of common practices that denies someone full humanity based on seeing them as less than or as a threat in some way to the favorite or the favored group. And I'm thinking of an example of that in a volunteer organization that I was part of, where I invited a high schooler who was the daughter of a friend of mine to come and volunteer for a festival actually that was going to involve youth and younger people. And she was told to do some things, and actually one person told her to wait for further instruction, and so she and her friend were waiting and looking at their phones. In the meantime, another older volunteer came over and said, "What are you girls doing just standing around looking at your phones? Why aren't you doing something?" That was an othering experience for sure that, you know, made this person not ever want to come back. And I think we can do othering in so many ways in our organization, and it's kind of important to pay attention to that. And I am going to actually play John Powell talking about, because he does it, these are his concepts and he does a wonderful job. So we're going to listen for about 3 minutes to him talking about othering and then reflect a little on that for ourselves. So I'm going to try and make this work here. We're going to do this. Let's see. Billy, are you going to be able to help me a little with this?
I can help you.
Okay.
If it doesn't open, I can run it on my end too.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah, for some reason it's not opening right now.
I will start it on my end, and then
Sure.
just let me know when you'd like me to stop.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Let me do that one more time. I forgot to click the sound.
Sure. So listen to what he has to say about othering.
Sometimes we think the way to deal with othering is saming. I don't see race. I don't see disability. We're all the same. A mosque is just like a church, it's just like a synagogue. And while that's purported to be, from a liberal space, be more welcoming, it's still erasing who we are. And it reminds me of James Baldwin. Some of you may know that at the height of his literary career, he was invited into high literary circles, and these things matter to him. And as they invited James Baldwin in, they said, "Come on in, Mr. Baldwin. We finally recognize that you can write." And Baldwin was happy. And he said, "But don't bring your riffraff, meaning other black people, with you, and you don't have to rub it in our face that you're gay." And James Baldwin said, "No thanks." And he instead wrote a book called The Price of the Ticket. And he was saying, the price of belonging, the price of joining was too high. I'm not going to join by committing existentialist suicide. Belonging has consequences, and othering has consequences. And we see this all around us. So we're here in Oakland, and some of you know about the famous barbecue, where a black person, a black family goes to a park, and a white woman is like, "What you doing in Oakland barbecuing? Get out of my space." Or where a black student, woman at Yale, is studying, and somebody calls the police on her. We call it learning while black. Or we have the whole meme of Black Lives Matter, because every day the police, the schools, housing authorities tell us that black lives don't matter. So not belonging being othered has serious consequences. And those consequences are literally a matter of life and death.
You could stop it right there, Billy. And we'll go back to hearing him talk about belonging in a minute. And I know, Martesha, I'm sure you all can discuss this more when you are having the discussion the next hour as well, but just want to check in with people. What are ways that we might reflect a little on what are ways we might other in our organizations? Or any thoughts or feelings that came up as you even listened to John Powell before we go into listening to what he talks about belonging, which is really powerful as well.
Well, I can give an example specifically surrounding volunteerism and engagement of volunteers. And so I believe there was previously this misconception that utilizing the same marketing channels, whether it's the Rockford Register Star or something of that sort, would welcome minority volunteers and people of diverse backgrounds. And it was just kind of this maybe concept of, well, we're opening it up for everyone, not really recognizing those differences and that we may receive information differently. And so that's the connection I built with othering specifically related to volunteers.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure you all will follow up with this more in the discussion. So Billy, I'd request you to play it again from where we stopped, because that's where he then starts talking about belonging.
And belonging means more than just having access. It means something much more profound than that. It's a variation of King's beloved community. There was a variation of someone else's beloved community. So we learn from each other. I work at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society at UC Berkeley. And we have a wonderful staff, and they're bringing you this conference, and you hear more from them, Rochelle and others. But we're changing our name. Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. It sounds pretty good. So why are we changing our name? So when you look at this slide, it will help you see this. So you have exclusion, which is obviously an extreme form of othering. And then you have inclusion. And sometimes people think of inclusion in the same way the people who invited James Baldwin in. That is, you can come in, but this is my house, this is my party, so behave yourself. You're a guest. Whether it's coming into Berkeley or whether it's coming into a hospital, the rules, the norms, the expectations are already set. And so what's the thing that you're joining? The thing that you're joining, the institution, the structure, the culture, oftentimes have profound biases already in place. And you're asked to come in and join and be quiet. Don't bring the riffraff with you. So I am the riffraff. So belonging is not simply joining something. Belonging is about co-creating the thing you're joining. And in order to co-create, you need power. So it's not your house or my house. It's not your city or my city. It's our city. We co-create it. We make it together with all of our complexities and dreams. And that's a very different process. So we haven't decided our new name yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if belonging is not part of the name. So inclusion is not enough. So belonging not only affects how we perceive things, it affects who we are. I am because you are. So what happens if you're not? What happens if you don't see me? What happens if you just view me? It has serious health consequences, serious political consequences, seriously democratic consequences, not just for me not being seen, but for you. This is 2019. 2019 is the 400th year since slaves were brought to the United States. They were brought not as people. They were brought as property, as other. And this process of enslaving people and denying people their humanity didn't just define what was happening with slaves and the enslaved people actually revolted. It defined America. It defined our institutions. It defined our structures. It defined our culture. And Toni Morrison made the observation that there are all these studies now about the trauma to black people of slavery, which is real. But she says we haven't looked at enough what this has done to white people. What this ideology of superiority and separateness has done to white people. And I always make the point that whiteness, in its most pernicious form, is a serious problem. But that's not the same as people who are phenotypically white, unless they adopt that ideology. And so one of the things we want to do is help free people, help free the world of the ideology of hierarchy, dominance, which is closely associated in the United States with whiteness. And it's not an easy process because it's so embedded in our culture, in our language, in our words. But that's not all that's embedded. The aspiration to connect, the aspiration to see each other, the aspiration to love is also there. So this is the challenge. What story will we live in? What story will we tell? What world will we live in? Will we have a world to live in? Some of you may have seen this. This is a study that came out of UT Austin. They had a situation down there where black and Latino students, they would bring them in and they wouldn't graduate, or it'd take them twice as long to graduate. And they spent millions of dollars trying to remediate these students. It's like, well, you went to a bad school, we understand that. You didn't properly learn, so we're gonna spend money to make sure you get it. And it didn't work. And in this story, the young woman, her mother said, well, you know what, maybe UT Austin is just too hard. Maybe you need to go to a community college. And then one of the professors called the students together and said, what is it like being here at UT Austin? And if you haven't been there, I'll just say it's a beautiful campus. They actually invited me down to consider starting an institute, teaching school. They offered me a lot of money for a faculty position. And as we're walking around the campus, we see Confederate memorabilia all over the place. General Lee, and if one of my hosts turns to me and says, don't pay attention to all that federal memorabilia. We fought on the side of the South in the Civil War. And he was a nice enough guy. And so I was nice to him. But I could tell you, my unconscious was saying, get the hell out of here, what are you doing? And so I knew that the students were experiencing the same thing. The point is that when they started talking about it, when it came out, when they stopped suppressing it, the black students and Latino students started doing so well that researchers said somebody was cooking the books. They're not that smart. That's not possible. The problem wasn't they had lack of knowledge. The problem was they didn't belong. And as soon as they had a sense of belonging, they started performing. Not only were they better off academically, they were better off in terms of their health as well. And we see this over and over again. So when we talk about bathrooms, this may seem like a small thing, but these symbols are important. They say you belong or you don't belong. You're human or you're not human.
Thanks, Billy. We can stop it there.
Thank
you so much. Okay, so wasn't that powerful? Yes, I wanted you to hear John Powell himself. I think he is, I know I've heard this many times and it moves me in different ways each time. And I just want to, as we wrap up today, ask you to reflect on, and I'm sure you can do this more in the discussion too, but what are thoughts and feelings as you heard John Powell about freeing the world from concepts of hierarchy and dominance, fostering belonging that promotes health. We don't often think about these issues affecting our overall health, but it sure does. And our engagement with the world. The aspiration to see each other, to connect, to love is also very much here. And even though that may be scary because that means we have to make ourselves vulnerable, I invite us all to tap into that. And I just want you to reflect as you leave today, or move into the discussion even of, you know, what are examples, as we said earlier, of othering that might happen in your organization or in our organizations? What has fostered belonging in our organizations historically? What has fostered belonging? And with everything going on in the world right now, what might be getting in the way of fostering belonging? Or what are different ways that we might need to foster belonging? What are things we might need to name based on what's happening in our sociocultural context right now that might be important, so that we're not pushing things under the rug or not noticing the elephant in the room? What might help us at this time? And also my last question that I'd ask you to reflect on is, how can we keep talking about this, or who can I consult with this about? Because none of us alone have the answers. And that's where working in community is so important, right? Like justice is what love looks like in public. And I know in my own work, I cannot do this work without doing it in community, which is why I'm so grateful to also have this opportunity to talk about this with you this morning. And I'm so grateful that a couple of people, wonderful folks, are going to facilitate a discussion further about this morning. And I just want to end by thanking you for joining us, for all you do in our beloved communities, keeping on paying attention to what nurtures us and bringing your gifts to the organizations that you are part of, and inviting other people to bring their gifts and be their whole selves in our organizations. And if you'd like to go deeper with this, do reach out to Billy or Pam or NICNE about this, or to me. More important, you know, keep staying involved, and also to breathe. I just want to end with asking you to just take a breath and center, and then transition, and I'll let Billy take over here as we do that. But really want to thank you so much for your presence and your participation this morning with me.
Thank you so much, Shiraz, for being with us this morning. That was a wonderful and thoughtful discussion. You're very much appreciated. So we are going to, I'll share a little information about some of our upcoming events in the fall. We are bringing John Powell to Rockford virtually for a student discussion on October 23rd from 9 to 11 a.m. where he's going to interact with area high school students and talk about othering and belonging with them. And then at noon that day, we'll have a small group discussion with community members and people moving the work on belonging forward. He is going to talk to about 18 people in a live session, which will be broadcast to the greater community. WREX is partnering with us to help us make that happen. So plan to see more information from me coming out in the next 2 or 3 weeks on that. I'll send a save the date and information on how to access that if you'd like to view it. So with that, we want to thank you very much again, Shiraz, and we're going to transition into the moderated discussion with Keri Asevedo and Martesha Brown. If you need to use the restroom or grab coffee, you can take 2 minutes to do that, and I'll give you a moment to get situated before we start our discussion.
Keri, is it okay if I stay? I'd love to hear what people have to say.
Yes, please.
Absolutely.
Yes, please. Awesome, thank you. All right, so it looks like lots of people are back, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, Billy, for running all of the technology. Shiraz, thank you for such an incredible conversation. We're so glad to have you and to have such a thoughtful discussion. Gives us opportunity to kind of reflect on experiences that we've had individually, but how that affects our organization. So thanks for a really great conversation. I took pages of notes, but it's one of the very last things you said that affected me the most. Justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. Wow. Like, what a powerful sentiment that, right, we're having this discussion. NICNE has done an incredible job of bringing people together to have such relevant conversation about belonging, but the word justice is being used on a daily basis in our society right now. And what a profound way to say what justice really is. It's what love looks like in public. And are we, you know, practicing justice in all of our systems? Education, housing, policing, nonprofit organizations. What an incredible introspective statement. So thank you for your conversation today. NICNE, thank you for bringing John Powell to Rockford. What an incredible opportunity for our community. Everyone should stay on point with that conversation and watch some of his work online. He has several books. There's, you know, so much knowledge and information that he has that we can prepare ourselves with prior to him coming here. So tell us what your aha moment was. I told you mine. Justice is what love looks like in public. So give me, tell me what your aha moment was. Like some things maybe you, you know, hadn't heard the word othering before. Maybe you thought about a time where you were excluded. Tell me what your aha moments were. Now's the time you have to take yourself off mute.
I'll say that I think that my aha moment was just thinking about, it's been a conversation here at Rockford Area Habitat for Humanity, how we can include people more. And I do think there's a subtle and important difference between including people and how are we excluding people. So we talk about how do we include people more. And I think in this discussion, I realized, oh, think of all of the ways that our, frankly, overwhelmingly white organization excludes the people we work with in small ways.
Yeah, Jennifer's agreeing with that. Learning the term equitable inclusion was my aha moment. I agree. That slide in specific that John Powell put up about inclusion versus belonging, and inclusion is including you in my world, as opposed to belonging is this idea of creating a world with you and creating policies and practices and those kinds of things. Kate Brown agrees. Thanks, Kate. That's awesome. Who else? Anybody else have an aha?
I just wanted to say I love the quote that John Powell said, the opposite of othering is not saming but belonging. I thought that was so brilliant. I was like, oh, you know, I just never thought about it in that perspective, and not completely ignoring the differences in others, you know, accepting those differences.
Amanda, I love those comments, and I'm not just saying it because we share the same last name, so we're saming it a little bit right now. But I love those comments. I think we've probably heard quite often in the community, I don't see color.
Yes.
And what do you think about that statement when you hear "I don't see color"? What is right or wrong with that statement? I won't steer you either way.
Well, I think people are trying, I don't think they understand that it's not the correct way to look at things. I feel like people are trying to be inclusive, but they're not going about it in the correct way. I don't think that they mean any harm. I just don't think that they're understanding what that means necessarily.
When I hear people say, I don't see color, I say, you don't see me.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you don't see me for who I am, my authentic self, which is my color is a part of that. So that's what I hear.
Mm-hmm.
Understand it is in good intentions for a lot of people, but that's how it's perceived.
Mm-hmm. And how do we
say it?
Yeah, how do we correct that? You know?
Yeah, I used to say it, Anisha. That breaks my heart, right? Because I do see you. I see you for a strong, intelligent, powerful leader. And I used to be one of those white people who would say, yeah, I don't see color. Everyone is the same. And such a short-sighted statement.
Well, it's only Martesha went back to and Amanda, celebrating our differences. We all have differences that we can bring to the table that are actually valuable, and will make whatever you're working on a lot stronger. So just recognizing that and capitalizing on those differences, I think this is great. So I'm gonna go on mute now. I'm done talking.
You're fine.
I would agree. I think, Matt, did you have a comment you wanted to share?
Yeah, I would just say that I always kind of take, in a lot of cases, it's like when race comes up and people say I don't see color, and it's really feels like just a coded way to say, can we please not talk about race or pretend it doesn't exist? But of course, it's only the most powerful people who have the luxury of saying race doesn't exist and then it not affecting them at all. When, you know, it's people of color who don't have the luxury of living in a colorblind world. It's only a thing a white person can do, is say, let's just I can ignore this and not talk about it, and then it doesn't exist to me. It goes away entirely.
Yeah, it's kind of, I've never heard this before, but I've never heard I don't see gender. Because we acknowledge that there are unique experiences, and so that's the same thing as it relates to our ethnicity. So yeah, very good comments, Matt. Definitely appreciate that. And it kind of leads us into going back into that topic of belonging. I think that was probably my aha moment, and I want to bring that forth as a question. In terms of belonging, I almost see it as creating a sense of, or creating an environment where everyone feels not only welcome, but included. And I just want to throw the question out there of, have you guys also had experiences where you felt like you did not belong? Or is there something you want to share on what you plan on doing in the future to ensure others belong?
There's a strong focus on how the very structure of an organization can allow for belonging or not. The story, the China experience of being the ultimate other. At Emmanuel Lutheran Church, we're studying a book called Dear Church, a love letter from the black preacher to the whitest denomination in the US. So churches say, oh, we welcome you. You want to be the only one who's different coming into that place? And I've thought of having a campaign in Rockford inspired by the Oscars, Chamber So White. Because look at the pictures in the publications of the Chamber. You very rarely see a person of color.
Good, very good points, Colin.
I will say the sense of belonging definitely resonates with me. For a long time, even coming from corporate America, where, the biggest things were diversity and inclusion, right? And everyone's on that bandwagon, and tons of training around that, right? Lots of literature out there. And then now it's that equity piece, which then now starts to develop into that sense of belonging, when all of those three pieces are thoroughly engaged and activated in your organization. So us looking at ourselves as nonprofits or volunteer organizations making sure we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about diversity, and we're talking about equity to create that sense of belonging for our volunteers. I think those three key pieces are, I mean, it's key, right? And so within Alignment Rockford, I will say we are working on all three in our volunteer base and being intentional in all three of being inclusive, ensuring diversity, and ensuring, equity in all of those. So redistribution of power, right? When it comes to things like that, and not, us versus them. We're the experts, they're not. We only need you as a focus group to get your opinion, and then we go back into our shells. So those are the three areas that we really focus on.
Absolutely. Any other things that you guys can see yourselves wanting to do at your organization to create more of a sense of belonging for volunteers?
Sorry, Martesha and Anisha, I just wanted to respond to something about the equity component. I've worked with a lot of nonprofits who, when we first started talking about equity, it came up as one more thing. And I'm sorry, for some reason my camera keeps cutting in and out. I felt that was a lame attempt to hide behind effort. Equity isn't one more thing we should be doing. And I fear work in the public sector, particularly in private industry, that focused on equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity always came first in that statement, right? So DEI. Diversity to me, if it comes first, is we're just checking boxes saying we have X number of certain types of people. That doesn't mean you have an inclusive environment. It doesn't mean you're going to bring equity to the conversation or to the environment to help lift up where otherwise we have oppressed, right? And so as we thought about that, I tried to combat the response to equity as one more thing. Is equity is the value we bring to the table, right? If we don't value each other and we don't approach things through an equitable lens and authentically do that, then we're really in a struggle at that point. Because if that's the case, then we need to address the biases that come with that, right? The reasons we're not feeling equity as a value that's important to us as individuals, us as an organization. And so I always push people to think about it should be equity, it should be inclusion, then it should be diversity, right? Because the other side of that is we've seen so many organizations move towards diversity without the value of equity, without creating an environment of inclusiveness. And then, voila, you've got, I'm just going to go with 30% Black staff, and they're all leaving because they don't feel safe or included, right? They don't feel there's a sense of belonging. It's, you just hired me for numbers, and you don't respect my heritage and the unique qualities I bring to your organization. So just food for thought from my perspective.
Yeah, Ron, that's such an interesting statement too, because diversity, the conversation of diversity is really grounded in othering, right? You're diverse from something, right? So you're diverse from the favored population, which is the definition of othering. So we have to start having conversations about equity and equality and belonging, as opposed to this idea of, for lack of a better term, and I apologize if this is offensive, having token, right? We don't want to be in a position as nonprofit organizations where we're diversifying our board of directors by having one person of color, because that is not belonging. That is counterproductive. That is creating this idea of now one person speaks for an entire, race of people, and it puts people in a superiority and inferiority complex. And so we have to talk about equity, and we have to be equitable. Sorry. Martesha, I know you're up. Sorry.
Oh, no, that is good. As you were talking, it was, and I heard from Ron, this is exactly what we were discussing. And I stole this from the YouTube video, and I saw that difference between exclusion, inclusion, and equitable inclusion. And this was a major takeaway for me. You can just see visually the difference, and that's exactly what happens. You know, maybe someone's asked to volunteer on a board because they look different, but are you actually allowing them to be able to share their experiences and their opinions? So I just threw that up there in case anybody else wanted to screenshot, because this is going on my wall.
So let's talk a little bit about, you know, we talked about this cultural lens, your individual lens, and then the lens of your organization. Let me remind you that this is a safe place, and this is a place we can have, you know, honest dialogue and conversation. That's the whole purpose of this series. I think as we get more comfortable and have more conversations, it'll be a little easier to maybe talk about these things. But I'm just going to ask a simple question. If your board of directors were asked the same question that you were asked today about what their values and what their lens was, would it be the same answer as yours? Do you feel that your board of directors holds the same values and uses the same lens as you? Tough question.
I'm just smiling, Keri, because I see some people like, and I can see the looks on their faces where that might not be the case.
Yeah. I don't necessarily think it is the case. Hi. I see your hand. Tell me your name again.
Lisa Johnson. I'm with LifeScape, with the RSVP program. And I'd have to say, I have no idea what the board thinks, because like Kristen said, I've never met them. I've had no contact with them. I don't know what their involvement in the organization is. So I don't know.
Wow. It's a very telling statement about how the people in your organization that are direct contact with your clients or those that you serve have no idea who the people are that set the vision for your organization. That is a significant, I think, differentiation in values and lens, of course. You have a completely different lens than they do.
Absolutely. I think as we're looking at this discussion, there was one question that was brought towards the end that we should be discussing, which is, who could and should I be talking with this about? Yeah. So let's start thinking about that action. Who could and should I be talking with this about? Any suggestions? Anish, I think I see you off of mute there.
Yeah, I was going to see if anyone else wanted to talk first. I'm talking a lot. I mean, being that we, work with a huge volunteer base, so talking to the alignment staff who are in direct contact with our volunteers and who are recruiting our volunteers, I think this is, which they were on the call earlier, during the presentation. So we will just, have this conversation in a staff meeting to making sure to see that we can walk through action steps to make sure we're doing those 3 key pieces. But then also you brought up the board as well. So, I mean, I won't say that hopefully I don't feel that as executive director, I'm the check the box mark as a Black woman, but, being, talking that conversation for 3 years with my board around diversity and inclusion and now this equity piece. I think this is a conversation that we all really need to have, and this kind of format, a training around what that means as far as board development and going forward. So those are the things that I would want to take action steps on.
Those are great steps.
Anyone else want to share who they plan to talk to this about or who they should be talking with this about?
This is Renee, Forest Preserve District, Will County, and I think that individuals should probably have a direct line to their leadership team, their directors on here, and that would help greatly start the discussions, if not continue the discussions.
Definitely agreed. Definitely agreed. I think as a personal reflection with sitting on boards, there's some team members that I've never met before. And, you know, if they're not asking that question, that's a question that I can ask as a board member. Who else is on this team and how can I take the opportunity to meet with them? Great points, Renee. Thank you.
So, right, we talked about action steps. Let's talk about barriers. So for those of you who, you know, have a direct connection to directors and senior leadership team and potentially boards of directors, what are your barriers? What's holding you back? What's stopping you from continuing this conversation or maybe even starting it?
Barb Ferry, Will County Forest Preserve, volunteer recruitment team member. I think a lot of it has to be based on fear. Fear of rocking the boat, fear of not being important enough to speak what you feel. Sometimes you think that you're the small peanut in the big bag of peanuts, and you're not. If you belong, then you have that right, you have that opportunity to speak from your own point of view, you know, what you're seeing, and maybe interpret that from your own personal standpoint when you began to be in the position that you are. I've been there for 20 years, and when I first got there, I didn't feel as secure as I am now. My roles have changed. I'm very diversified in what I can accomplish within the community there, and I'm thankful for that. And I think that if you are sincere enough, then you can let people know, you know, hey, this is how I felt. Let's try to shift the mindset.
That's a great point. What other barriers do we have?
I remember hearing about a book, Caste, The Origin of Our Discontents. I haven't read it yet, but a factor that's, I think, relevant for many of us is that in a board training, I remember hearing, what's the criteria for people to come on board? Well, how many thousands of dollars are they willing to contribute to be a member of the board? And the whole concept of caste, I mean, to me, the ultimate other is often the very wealthy, selfish millionaire. And a lot of people get on boards, not because they're so wonderful and eleemosynary. They want to have that to check off or somehow. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not true. You all have much more experience with boards than I do, but I thought I'd just bring that into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think those are very good points, Harlan. Kind of around that concept, and then also what was just discussed around this feeling of fear. I'm going to ask that we take a moment to just kind of be vulnerable, and let's talk about what made you feel uncomfortable in this conversation. What made you take a moment of self-reflection? And knowing that we're family here. That's what I'll call this. We're family here, so this is safe, it stays here, but what made you feel uncomfortable? Where did you have to do some personal self-reflection?
Well, this is Robin from the Rockford Rescue Mission. Our volunteer base is very diverse. And I absolutely, when I interview people, have no idea even what sex they are. I've been interviewing someone over the phone who I thought was a female and was going to put him into the women's crisis, which absolutely would not work. And so until I see them, I often, know very little about them. But on a personal level, my heart this weekend, it became crushed because I heard from my son who, and this is, my family isn't aware of this. I heard from my son who lives in Chicago, who says he cannot come home for the holidays because of the beliefs and the racist comments of my parents, some of my siblings, and many of my family. And he said, Mom, it's making me sick. And he said, every time I think I'm gonna get over it, then someone sends a copy of something to me, and it just lets me know that they are so far away from where I am. I don't want to fight with them. I don't want to argue with them. I don't know what to do. And so I've just been praying all week and crying a lot, because I certainly don't want him to lose his connection to his family, but he's making a choice that I agree with. And last night I had an opportunity to kind of talk to my parents, and when I came at them with facts and statistics, at first they, and they're 85 and 82, they came back with me and they're like, that can't be right. And I'm like, it is right. It is right. I've sat in so many trainings and I've sat in so many things that this is right, that our world is not one color. It is so many colors and so many different things that you have got to just accept people and love people, and not look at their skin. One of the people in my life, Theresa Gilbert from Rock Valley College, took me under her wing and taught me so much about African Americans. And she was one of the few people I could be vulnerable with. And she would say, no, you don't want to say that. You should say this. And because of her training and her loving care to me, I've been able to pass that on a little bit. But those of you who pray, please do pray for my family, because it's going to be ugly at Christmas when people start asking questions why some of my nieces and some of my nephews aren't coming and my son's not coming, because of not only the Black Lives Matters, but the thing that's really bothering them is the police right now are really having a huge impact. My nephew lives in Kenosha, and so what they're dealing with has a huge impact on our family, and it's heartbreaking. So anyway.
Thank you, Robin, for sharing that moment. And not that my personal opinion matters, but I just applaud you and I applaud your son. You guys are taking a stance that is very difficult to take. And so I know personally I will pray for your family as you guys navigate through this, but I just want to let you know that I applaud your strength in being able to, like you said, self-reflect and take a stance. So thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Can I share something? Is my mic on? My name is Pam. I work at Safe Passages in DeKalb. So with the topic of being vulnerable, a big part of what holds me back, and I could also say maybe other women of color feel this way too, is that because of my race and my identity, they don't hear me. Or when I talk, it's automatically, it sounds radical or it sounds too aggressive. And when it comes to my race being an Asian woman, the stereotype is we're supposed to be submissive. So the fact that I'm speaking out already sounds too loud for them. And when I think about leadership and board, they all have one identity and it's not mine. And so they're already not understanding or hearing. And even though they don't necessarily say all lives matter, they still act that way when they aren't acknowledging different identities, like what Martesha was saying earlier of, why don't we actively say we are recruiting for minoritized volunteers? There's nothing wrong with saying that. In fact, as a person of color myself, that for me, reading that an organization is actively looking, it is a sign of like, okay, it might be safe. And I've had these conversations, but it can get really difficult. And people of color know really well, even if they haven't said it to leadership or their coworkers, but they know when the agency is not willing to hear it. Even though they say that they're committed to equity and inclusion, we know what actual belonging feels like. So it's almost like you have to face these two roads of, do you actually try and you know what's gonna happen, or do you just kind of stay quiet because it's less emotionally taxing to go that route? I've been in organizations where I'm definitely that token hire, and they expected so much from me besides my actual role to educate people on diversity and race issues, when I know for a fact they're not ready to hear it. Because I am also the type of person or trainer to say things like white supremacy, because you have to name things in order to dismantle it. And there are people who are really not there, and that's fine. But if your job puts you in that situation, you can't really say no, because you do need that paycheck at the end of the day. So that is a big barrier for minoritized people and agencies that don't necessarily reflect their identity or other people's identity, is that fear factor. Because at the end of the day, we do need our jobs. And when it comes to recruiting people as well, this was a thought I had earlier in one of our discussions was, as a woman of color, I am able to bring and recruit volunteers from diverse backgrounds. That is a connection that I have. It's just something that people of color, you know, we can talk about race because we talk about race all the time. So it's really easy to draw them in, but it's hard to keep them. No matter how great I am with them, they will automatically feel like they don't belong just for the mere fact that leadership does not look like them, and the art in the building doesn't reflect them and their values, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a big barrier, even within just trying to find and manage and keep volunteers too, is that race piece is really important, and it's really difficult when organizations don't want to talk about it. And I think right now, as a whole country, we're dealing with a reckoning, but especially with how leadership is acting. So that they're not going to be talking about Jacob Blake, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, et cetera, and police brutality. It does set a tone for what people of color already know about the agency. So that's what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Pamela, I don't know if it's weird to want to applaud, but I want to applaud you for your comments. I mean, there were so many nuggets and notes that I plan on sharing with our leadership team from what you just said. And even the really key point of what's going on with like police brutality and the Breonna Taylor and all the stuff that's going on, and the silence right now, the silence puts you on a side that you may not want to be on. And so if there was any type of encouragement that I would give, please have a discussion. Because your minority team members, if they're not hearing you take a stance in any type of way, or at least having a conversation, then you have identified the way you view diversity and inclusion at your agency, and you will lose those team members. Very key. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Pamela.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela. What an incredible, insightful comments, I guess I should say. So, you know, social media has changed our world dramatically, and it has given voice to people on both sides of this movement, right? I think we can all agree that this is our generation's civil rights movement, and we either get to be on the right side of that movement or the wrong side of that movement, right? And for many of us, what we choose to do personally might be different than what our organizations choose, or what our colleagues choose, or what our board members choose. And you know, Robin, your most intimate relationship is with your family, right? With your son. And you're already we're already there and having, you know, conversations about what does the Thanksgiving table sound like this year, right? And are people going to be having conversations about justifying why, you know, Kyle Rittenhouse did what he did? And there will be other people on the complete opposite end of that conversation saying, he went there to kill. He went there with an automatic rifle. He wasn't protecting his own personal property. You don't bring an assault rifle, right, to a protest like that and not think that there's one outcome, right? But there are so many people on both sides of that conversation, and social media, mainstream media, whatever you want to call it, has you know, definitely, you know, brought that to our forefront. And so we have to make conscious decisions every day as both white allies and as people of color about how we're going to engage in this conversation and who we're going to engage in this conversation. And we can't let fear stop that conversation. We have to be comfortable in our own skin and in our own thoughts and ideals to have really tough, uncomfortable conversations. And it might be with some of the most important people in your life, like my dad, whom I love with my whole heart, but is so old school in you know, lots of his thinking. And so we have to acknowledge how we feel, and we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. Martesha, you're so right. We have to get comfortable with this, and we have to get comfortable having these conversations, because if we're not comfortable having them in our homes and with our children, we have to, you know, that then moves into our professional lives, and we have to be comfortable having those conversations with our colleagues and with our board members and with our volunteers and with the people we serve. We can no longer afford to be silent. And we have to educate ourselves. We have to give ourselves every opportunity to gather as much information about this as possible, have these kinds of dialogues so that, you know, when we're out there and we're having conversations, whether it's, you know, I really try, Ron, you know, I try not to have conversations with people on the Rockford Register of Star Facebook page and the WREX page, but sometimes I just can't control myself. Sometimes I just can't control myself, but we have to get uncomfortable. We have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. This is modern day civil rights movement, and we all need to be on the right side of that movement.
Yeah, I agree, and I may have shared this at the previous session, and I think I've been trying to share it with as many people as possible, but there's a bright young lady by the name of Austin Taylor that I have the honor of working with at the RACVB, and we just, in one of our discussions, she said, I wish people would realize that this is not a moment, it's a movement. So there's not a Band-Aid fix for this. It's not a moment, it is a movement. So I've been sharing that with the world. There's not a Band-Aid fix for this. Nope. There's not a wrong or right way, I would say, in terms of your stage where you're at, or your place that you're at in your allyship. You have to do what's comfortable for you, but you have to move. You may not be the person that's walking the streets that's protesting. You may not be the person that walks into the boardroom and says, there's no diversity here, but you may be that person that has the conversation in your home, or you may address a fellow friend that's maybe making a statement that appears to be biased or is maybe not coming from a loving place. But I just encourage everyone to just realize, as she told me, and I'll hold true to this, it's not a moment, it's a movement, and we all need to move.
We all need to move.
I just wanted to add, you know, Keri, what you said, and Martesha as well, the little point there is, you know, it's, when you guys brought up, it's, you know, it's going to be uncomfortable, right? And you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Just let everyone here on the call know it's not comfortable for people of color to talk about these experiences. we're really putting ourselves out there and being very vulnerable. And you know how you can feel as a vulnerable person sharing your story, because we just don't know how that's going to be perceived, right? It's going to be taken the wrong way. We don't want to offend, right? It's not, so sharing our stories is very uncomfortable for us as well. So don't think that what we're sharing or what's happening, that we're comfortable with this and we're, pointing fingers. We're all uncomfortable in this process as we're working through it. So just be well aware and be secure in that you're not the only uncomfortable person in the room when these conversations are being had. So just wanted to let you guys know that what Keri said and what Martesha said, it's for everyone is. This is a difficult conversation for everyone. It's and can weigh heavy on everyone in the room.
Thank you
This
for
is Harlan.
saying that.
And I just want to mention the most powerful resource I know of in dealing with these difficult conversations is nonviolent communication, as developed by Marshall Rosenberg. It's avoiding playing the game where everybody loses, which is who's right. And learning how to talk and listen using, it's English, but it's almost like learning a different language. Learning I won't go into it, but if anyone's interested, let me know and I'll talk with you about it.
Thank you, Harlan. Anisha, thank you for saying that, because I think a lot of people assume that you're comfortable and that the people who have to be uncomfortable are the people who look like me. And I recognize after years of working with Habitat that that's not true, that you are just as uncomfortable in these situations. And in fact, you've been uncomfortable most, for a lot of your life. When Shiraz asked us earlier to think about external situations in which we felt excluded, it was easy for me to think of I have kind of two things in my mind. One is being a woman on a construction site and running a construction company. I consistently, get told to hit the nail with my purse, which everyone thinks is funny except me, because I actually know how to use a hammer. So I feel very excluded at our all-white male, men work sites, right, where I literally get told to hit the nail with my purse. And people make comments about my shoes. Like, no man shows up on a construction site and another guy says to him, "Oh, you're wearing those kind of shoes today." Like, that's what people say to me, right? The second thing that I thought of about this kind of external idea of not feeling like I belonged was the first time I flew. I never flew as a kid. I mean, we never traveled. We went on like 2 vacations as children. We grew up on food stamps with housing assistance. We grew up I grew up, very poor. And I'd never flown in my whole life. And all of my friends had flown. It was my senior year of college. I was 21, I think, years old. My friend had graduated the previous year and gotten a job with Delta Airlines and was like, "Yeah, just fly, come here for spring break. And, I'll fly you to Boston. The airline ticket is so, cheap because you get to fly standby prior to when the world exploded on 9/11. I had no idea what to do. I had no idea. And I've never felt so lost and so excluded from, being in the know than I did that day. But when you asked me to think about internal places where I felt like I belonged, I could have written hundreds. And that was a really very telling moment for me, that it was so much easier for me to think about places where I felt safe, places where I felt like I belonged, than it was for me to think about places where I didn't. And I need to consistently, right, check my implicit bias. I'm not an explicit biases don't come out of my mouth, right? I'm not one of those people, but I know I have implicit bias and I consistently recognize it. And so I ask people to help me with that. And so Anisha, I know we spend a lot of time together and we get the privilege of working together. And so I consistently want you to have dialogue with me about whether or not my implicit bias is showing, right? Whether my white privilege is showing, because I think Martesha and I have such an open and honest, relationship, and lots of people on this call, Ron and I have, spent a lot of years together talking about housing discrimination and what we can do to fix those things. And I'm working on a daily basis to try to, change some of those systems and policies and laws even. But as a person, I think one of my next steps is to ask people in my life to check me, to check those comments. And you're looking at that from, your lens, from your privilege. Look at this from my lens. And so find those people in your life that you can have those conversations with, your colleagues, your peers, your board members, and let's hold each other accountable for those things, because it happens every day. We say things every day. We interact in specific ways because we bring our history and our culture to that conversation.
Keri, this is Megan from Hanover Township Aging Services, and I just appreciate everything you just stated and some of the experiences you had. I had a similar situation with the sexist comments that, we had a maintenance person who would call us girls. You girls are working me too hard. It's your job. Like, stop. So what I found works really helpful, and maybe you do this already, is like, play dumb. Like, I don't understand. What do you mean use my purse? Like, what do you mean? Could you explain that to me? Like, put them in that position, because like, dude, I will hammer this thing all by myself. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I love that. And Keri, if it wasn't for you, I probably would have gone to the construction site with my heels on, because they're fabulous and I love them. So there. So if it wasn't for you giving me proper instruction. So just let's take just a couple of quick minutes, because we'll be wrapping up soon here, just to say if there's any final thoughts, or how have you guys felt about this discussion? Any final thoughts?
Can I say something as an addition to what Keri had said? So I just want to advocate for people of color, that it isn't people of color's job to hold white people accountable, only because that is emotional labor. If you are asking that from a person of color, you can Venmo them, you can give them money, because that it's really emotional taxing, and it's almost re-traumatizing. As a person of color, you never know how a white person is going to react to actually being checked. And Keri, I know you don't mean anything mean by that, but I just wanted to put that out there, that sometimes, even for myself, I have nice, comfortable relationships with specific white people, but that is definitely by no means am I going to be the person to constantly check them. And because if I'm not checking them, that doesn't mean that they have the right to continue what they're doing. I just wanted to put that out there.
That's a really great point. Thank you for making that comment. You're absolutely right. It's not your job. It's not your job.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it's a good balance. I appreciate that. And just knowing, just to kind of reiterate that, understanding that sometimes your friends, people of color, may not be interested in having that conversation. I can tell you guys, I am a very strong woman. This past Sunday was a mental wellness break. I just had so much coming at me related to, what do you think about this and what do you think about that? And so just respect that if you do bring that up, if that friend or that confidant decides, I'm just not ready, just respect it. It's nothing against you. They just may need to have a break. So any other final thoughts?
I guess I had one final thought here. As Pamela had said, that it's emotionally taxing. It's emotionally taxing on both relationships, whether you're a person of color or you're the person with the white privilege, right? I have a friend who said to me, well, you don't know, you're a rich white girl. You don't know how I grew up. You don't know. And that I have to explain that to people for them to understand. My husband has a job where we're doing well. thankfully. But I didn't grow up like that. I grew up like Keri. And just because I don't necessarily have this skin color doesn't mean that some of the stuff is not similar. So just like it's emotionally taxing, I mean, I would look at my relationships and see who would be the safe person to put me in that check, just like any friendship. If I was being helicopter mom and my friend was like, hey, you need to take a step back, otherwise your kids are never going to learn independence, I don't see that these conversations are any different in that aspect, because you're helping the world and the community understand it from your side. So as emotionally taxing it is, it's kind of like saying, well, you should Venmo them. It's like kind of one of those things where I'm like, you want to be heard, and I'm not asking you to come to me, but if it really does offend you, or it's something that I said that makes you feel uncomfortable, please come to me, and hope that I really do, that I take that conversation and I hold it in, and I think about what and how I say things, because not all of us use the proper grammar all the time. Not all of us think before we speak, and and maybe I do need that check, and I know that it's tolling. I do know it's tolling. I know that it's a hard thing to say to somebody, but when I had to look at that person and say, you don't know, like, for you to call to assume that I'm rich because I'm white, or assume that I live a better life because I'm white. It just, that's tolling too. It's tolling to be on the other side of that. But that I know that I want to be a person who is corrected and can think of that in the future,
If I was to
Hello.
add it, did I hear someone?
Yeah, hi, this is Felicia from Leo. I just want to comment on Christine. I do thank you for being open and honest about this. My point of view, and I am Mexican by birth, American by privilege. And when I hear about racism and classes and things like this, my belief is that racism is racism no matter what race are we talking about. If we are against white people just because they have some advantage on some things and we're going to be racist to them, still racism. It's still racism if we do it to blacks, to American, white, Native Americans, to Indo-Americans, to Hindus. It is racism, period, no matter what. I mean, we have to be able to not ourselves that we are against all this. Stop making the groups, and well, it's okay to be toward white Americans because they have the power. So let's be racist to them, or let's be hard to them, or let's put them in their place just because they have that. I believe that racism is racism no matter what. And I think that we all have to be able to check ourselves and be able to go and make friends of all races, creeds, language. And then that will be a true testament of who we are and how do we see people in all the places in their lives, where they are. So thank you for your time. This has been a great, great discussion. I love coming to this discussion. I love being able to learn. Thank you for sharing your minds with me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Keri, if you could mind, I know we're getting close on time, and I know we'll have future discussions about this, and a lot of these topics are very, very sensitive. I would encourage us all to really focus in on bias versus racism or racist. I think that we all have biases. I know for me, when I walk in a boardroom and I see nothing but white males, I initially think they all are well off, that they may have biased opinions about women, and they definitely may have biased opinions about women of color. And so I think that that is a bias, and I would hate for us to associate the biases that we naturally have based upon the lens in which we grew up with being associated with being racist. And I know that that will be future discussions that we will have. We all have biases, and it hurts. And I think at this point in time, it's becoming more exposed than others. But I would encourage you to just realize that those biases and that reflection has been experienced at a greater level by minority individuals. And so there's a certain level of sensitivity there. So, all right, I'll hand it back to you, Keri, to wrap us up.
Thank you. Just as a reminder, there's an evaluation at the end of or a survey at the end of each of these sessions. As you know, this was supposed to be a full day training that we have now broken up into a 12-month series, which I think actually is going to be significantly more beneficial because we can really have some deep dialogue. So Shiraz, thank you so much for your presentation today. What a incredible presentation you gave to us today. Thank you for participating and for even staying and being a part of the discussion afterwards. Billy sent the link, but you'll also get a recording of the session afterwards. So don't ever hesitate to contact us if you need anything, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I love the wave phenomenon of Zoom.
I love it. All right, bye everyone, take care.
Yes.